My parents threw me out on the street on my birthday. Now they're claiming the house I bought is a family asset. When I turned 27, I felt like life was slipping past me. My days were a monotonous cycle of working at a marketing firm and returning to a house that barely felt like home. My parents, Diana and Greg, had seen better days, both in their relationship and in the crumbling walls of the house we shared. Add my younger brother Ethan to the mix, and you had a recipe for a household that thrived on tension. Ethan, at 24, still acted like the king of the castle, despite his sporadic part-time jobs and a superiority complex that could rival a CEO's. I paid the bills, bought the groceries, and chipped away at repair costs for the house. I thought it was my way of contributing while I saved up for a place of my own. But instead of gratitude, my efforts were met with Diana's cutting remarks about how I wasn't settled yet or Ethan's condescending smirks whenever I spoke about my career ambitions. I'd learned to swallow the bitterness, telling myself that things would get better. My 28th birthday was supposed to be a turning point. For weeks, I had scrimped and saved to buy a fancy cake from a bakery downtown. It was a small indulgence, a token of self-appreciation amidst the chaos. In a fleeting moment of optimism, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this year would be different. Maybe Diana would set aside her passive-aggressive commentary. Maybe Greg would remember to look up from his endless news broadcasts. Maybe Ethan would say something, anything kind. The day arrived, and I spent most of it at work. My colleagues had surprised me with a small celebration, complete with cupcakes and laughter. For a brief moment, I felt valued. That feeling carried me home, where I imagined, naively, that my family might have something special planned. As I pulled into the driveway, though, my stomach dropped. All my belongings were scattered across the lawn. Bags of clothes, books, and even the cake box lay in haphazard piles. The shock hit me like a tidal wave. My first instinct was to think there had been some sort of mistake, maybe a misunderstanding. But then I saw her. Diana stood on the porch with arms crossed, her face a mask of icy determination. Greg lingered behind her, avoiding eye contact, and Ethan watched from an upstairs window, his expression unreadable but unmistakably smug. I stepped out of the car, each step feeling heavier than the last. Diana's words, when they came, were sharp and devoid of emotion. She told me it was time for me to spread my wings and learn independence. Her justification? It was her birthday gift to me. The twisted irony of her words hit like a punch to the gut. I glanced at Greg, hoping for some intervention, but he just muttered something about how it was for my own good. Ethan had the audacity to wave as I turned back to the car. I never felt so hollow. Anger, betrayal, and humiliation churned inside me, but no words came out. There is nothing to say to people who had planned this so carefully, who saw my departure not as a loss but as a relief. I loaded my car with as much as it could carry, the cake box crushed beneath the weight of hastily packed bags. I didn't look back as I pulled out of the driveway. If I did, I might have screamed, cried, or worse. That night, I found myself in a dingy motel room with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew. The tears came in waves, soaking the pillow I'd brought from home. It was a surreal, out-of-body experience. How had I gone from dutiful daughter to discarded inconvenience in a single day? My phone buzzed with texts from colleagues wishing me a happy birthday, blissfully unaware of the wreckage my life had become. Somewhere between the sobs and the silence, a resolve began to form. If this was the independence Diana wanted me to learn, I would take it. But not on her terms. I would rebuild my life, brick by brick, without their scorn hanging over me. Tomorrow, I would start looking for a new job, a new apartment, a new future. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, defiant spark amidst the ruins of a ruined birthday. The first few days after leaving my parents' house were a blur. My emotions swung wildly between anger and despair, with exhaustion as the only constant. I threw myself into work, spending late nights at the office, bearing the sting of rejection under piles of reports and deadlines. My boss, Rachel, began to notice the strain. She's the kind of manager who rarely mixes personal and professional matters, but something must have tipped her off. One evening, as I stared blankly at my computer screen, she quietly approached and asked if I was okay. I hesitated but then told her everything, how my family had thrown me out on my birthday, leaving my belongings on the lawn like trash. Her expression softened, and for a moment, she simply listened, her silence a rare comfort amidst the chaos. Her offer was unexpected but genuine. She had a guest room in her home, modest but comfortable, and she said I could stay there as long as I needed to get back on my feet. At first, I hesitated. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat, like I couldn't handle things on my own. But the reality of my dwindling savings and the soul-crushing motel was enough to push me to accept her kindness. Rachel's house was everything my parents' home wasn't: warm, welcoming, and free of judgment. The guest room was small but spotless, with a cozy bed and a window overlooking a garden. For the first time in days, I slept without the weight of the world pressing down on my chest. I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in a while: hope. Amidst all this upheaval, I reconnected with Jake, a close friend from college. We hadn't spoken much since graduation, but when I reached out, he didn't hesitate to step in. Our conversations became a lifeline. Jake had a way of cutting through the fog of my self-doubt, reminding me of the determination that had once carried me through countless all-nighters and stressful exams. He told me to take my anger and betrayal and turn them into fuel. "Prove them wrong," he said during one of our late-night calls. And that became my mantra. With Jake's encouragement and Rachel's quiet support, I began to rebuild. I took on extra freelance projects, adding to the already long hours at my full-time job. The work was grueling, and there were nights when I barely got any sleep, but every paycheck felt like a small victory. I opened a separate savings account, a tangible symbol of my independence. Each deposit, no matter how small, was a step closer to my new life. Still, the scars of my family's betrayal lingered. Sleepless nights often brought back memories of Diana's cold dismissal and Ethan's smug indifference. I'd lie awake, replaying their words, questioning if I had ever truly belonged in that house. But then the victories, no matter how small, kept me going. A glowing email from a client praising my work. A compliment from Rachel about a campaign I spearheaded. These moments reminded me that I was capable, that I wasn't defined by their rejection. I learned to find solace in the small rituals of my new life. Cooking simple meals in Rachel's kitchen, listening to her stories about her own struggles and triumphs, and hearing Jake's voice over the phone as he shared tales of his chaotic workdays. These fragments of connection slowly stitched me back together. One evening, as I sat in Rachel's kitchen working on a freelance project, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the window. For the first time, I didn't see someone drowning in failure. I saw someone fighting, someone surviving. And that realization gave me the strength to keep going. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the wounds from my family's betrayal hadn't healed. But piece by piece, I was reclaiming my life, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was the one in control of my story. Months passed, and life finally started to resemble something stable. The relentless work paid off when I achieved what had once seemed unattainable, a promotion to lead designer. With the new title came a substantial raise and an unexpected surge of pride. For years, I had been overshadowed by criticism and doubt, but now I had tangible proof of my capabilities. Rachel's support had been instrumental, and I made sure to thank her at every opportunity. Even Jake, who'd been my emotional anchor, cheered me on like the loyal friend he was. Life felt lighter, if only for a moment. That's when the call came. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something made me pick it up. The voice on the other end was unmistakably Ethan's. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar tone of restraint, even hesitation. I froze, unsure whether to hang up or listen. He started with small talk, clearly stalling, until he finally admitted the reason for his call. Our parents were in trouble. Greg had lost his job a few months ago, Ethan explained, and Diana's spending habits had spiraled out of control. They were drowning in debt, and the house, the same house they'd thrown me out of, was on the brink of foreclosure. He asked for my help, his voice cracking ever so slightly. It was a sound I'd never heard from him before. A wave of conflicting emotions hit me. Anger surged to the surface first, hot and unyielding. They had discarded me like I was nothing. Yet now, in their moment of desperation, they had the audacity to come to me? But then, underneath the anger, there was something else. Guilt, perhaps. Or maybe just the lingering ache of wanting to belong to a family that had never truly embraced me. My silence stretched on, and Ethan, taking it as an opening, pressed harder. He painted a picture of Diana's frantic attempts to maintain appearances and Greg's quiet despair. Ethan himself, for all his smug superiority, admitted that he couldn't fix this alone. His voice wavered as he pleaded, asking me to reconsider my grudge for the sake of the family. It was a low blow, invoking the concept of family after everything they'd done. And yet it stung. I finally spoke, my words measured and cold. I reminded him of my birthday, of the way they had discarded me, without a second thought. I told him how I'd slept in a dingy motel that night, choking on the bitterness of betrayal. Ethan tried to interject, but I didn't let him. I listed every sacrifice I'd made for them, every instance where my loyalty had been met with scorn. When I finished, the silence on his end was deafening. Despite my resolve, the call left me shaken. Part of me hated the idea of them suffering, but another part relished the justice of it all. For years, I had poured myself into that family, and they'd thrown me aside like an afterthought. Was it so wrong to stand my ground now? To protect the life I had painstakingly rebuilt? Ethan's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and accusing. He called me selfish, claimed I'd abandoned them in their time of need. The words stung more than I cared to admit, but I held firm. I told him that I wouldn't let myself be used, not again. He hung up without another word, leaving me alone with the weight of the conversation. That night, I sat in Rachel's garden, staring up at the stars. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the memory of their betrayal. This wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. For the first time, I chose myself over their approval. And though the choice came with its own kind of pain, it also brought a sense of liberation. I wasn't the same person they had discarded. I was stronger now, and I wouldn't let anyone take that away from me. Buying my first home was more than a milestone, it was a statement. After years of feeling like an afterthought in my own family, I finally had something that was entirely mine. The modern two-bedroom house, with its sleek kitchen and a backyard garden, represented more than just shelter. It was freedom, stability, and proof of my hard-won independence. Moving in was a blur of emotions, a mix of pride and disbelief that I'd finally reached this point. For once, my life felt like it was mine to control. That peace, however, didn't last long. Just a month after settling in, a knock on the door shattered my quiet afternoon. Standing there were Diana, Greg, and Ethan, looking far too comfortable for an unannounced visit. Their forced smiles and exaggerated cheeriness set off alarm bells. They claimed they wanted to reunite as a family, their words dripping with false sincerity. Suspicion coiled tightly in my chest, but I stepped aside, letting them in. It was a mistake I wouldn't make again. As they settled into my living room, their act quickly unraveled. The pretense of familial bonding gave way to the real reason for their visit. They wanted me to house them. Diana began with a rehearsed speech about families sticking together and how they had always done their best for me, despite evidence to the contrary. Greg sat silently, his presence a mere shadow as Diana's words grew sharper. Ethan, lounging on my couch like he owned it, smirked at me, clearly enjoying my discomfort. I sat across from them, listening as Diana painted herself as the long-suffering matriarch who had sacrificed so much for her ungrateful daughter. Her words stung, but not because they were true. It was the audacity, the entitlement, that made my blood boil. She spoke as if my success belonged to them, as if the house I had worked tirelessly for was some communal asset they could now claim. Ethan, emboldened by Diana's tirade, chimed in with cutting remarks about how selfish I had become. He mocked my accomplishments, downplaying the years of struggle that had led me here. His words were laced with bitterness, a stark contrast to the confidence he had exuded during our last conversation. Greg finally spoke, mumbling something about how hard things had been for them and how they just needed a place to regroup. It was a transparent plea for charity, cloaked in guilt-laden rhetoric. The tension in the room reached a boiling point when Diana declared that I owed them for everything they had done for me. Her tone was cold, almost mechanical, as she listed every perceived sacrifice they had made, sacrifices I knew were more fiction than fact. She framed their actions as acts of love, conveniently omitting the years of neglect and criticism that had defined our relationship. Something inside me snapped. I stood up, my voice calm but firm as I told them exactly what I thought. I reminded Diana of the day they had thrown me out, of how their family values had conveniently excluded me when it suited them. I listed every instance of their indifference, every moment I had been made to feel like a burden rather than a daughter. Ethan tried to interrupt, but I silenced him with a glare that left no room for argument. Diana, refusing to back down, escalated the confrontation. She threatened legal action, claiming she had rights to family property, as if my house fell under that category. It was a desperate move, one that only solidified my resolve. I told her in no uncertain terms that they had no claim to my life, my success, or my home. I had built this from the ground up, and I wouldn't let them tear it down. The final blow came when I asked them to leave. Ethan muttered something under his breath, but Diana's icy glare silenced him. Greg, true to form, said nothing as they filed out, their attempts at guilt-tripping me failing spectacularly. As I closed the door behind them, a wave of relief washed over me. The house once again felt like mine. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I reflected on the encounter. There was no satisfaction in their humiliation, only a profound sense of closure. For years, I had craved their approval, their love, but this confrontation made one thing abundantly clear. I didn't need it anymore. I had built a life for myself, one that didn't rely on their validation. And while their visit had rattled me, it also reaffirmed what I already knew. I was stronger without them. The fallout from my family's unexpected visit lingered like a bad taste. Their entitlement and threats had shaken me, but it also solidified my resolve to protect the life I had worked so hard to build. I called Jake the next morning, explaining the situation in detail. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, his tone was calm yet firm. As a lawyer, he'd seen cases like this before, and he knew exactly what steps to take. Jake's investigation into my parents' finances uncovered a tangled web of mismanagement. Their debts were far worse than Ethan had let on. Credit cards maxed out, unpaid loans, and, most concerning, evidence of tax evasion. Diana and Greg had been living beyond their means for years, their desperation now spilling over into my life. Jake laid out the options, and together, we decided to file a restraining order. It wasn't just about keeping them out of my home, it was about drawing a firm line they couldn't cross. While the legal process unfolded, Diana and Greg retaliated in the only way they knew how, by weaponizing gossip. Word spread through mutual acquaintances and distant relatives, all parroting the same narrative, that I was an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her family in their time of need. It was infuriating, but Jake's advice was clear. Silence was my strongest defense. Engaging with their lies would only give them more power. Instead, I poured my energy into my work, using the frustration as fuel for success. The restraining order was granted without much resistance, but the battle was far from over. Further investigations into my parents' finances revealed the full extent of their deceit. Tax fraud charges were filed, and creditors began circling like vultures. Ethan's smugness disappeared, replaced by frantic calls and messages, which I ignored. They had made their choices, and now they had to face the consequences without dragging me down with them. Despite the legal victories, the emotional toll was immense. Nights were the hardest, the quiet amplifying my anger and sadness. Cutting ties with my family felt like tearing out a part of myself. The urge to explain, to defend my side of the story, was overwhelming at times. But Jake's reassurance kept me grounded. He reminded me that I had done everything I could, that my decision to protect myself wasn't selfish, but necessary. As the weeks turned into months, the noise began to fade. My career flourished, each milestone a reminder of the life I was building on my own terms. The house, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a sanctuary. I spent evenings in the garden, tending to plants that thrived under care and patience, a quiet metaphor for my own journey. One evening, as I stood in my living room, looking out at the world beyond my windows, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The chaos and toxicity that had defined so much of my past no longer had a hold on me. For the first time in years, I felt free. The pain of my family's betrayal hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined me. Jake's words echoed in my mind, resilience and courage. Those qualities had carried me through the darkest moments, and they would continue to guide me forward. My reflection in the glass wasn't just someone surviving anymore. It was someone thriving, standing tall despite everything. This was my life now, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away again.